Hello, everyone. Welcome to Celsius 233, your go-to place for fiction book summaries. Today, we will unravel the story within the Vicomte de Bragelonne by Alexandre Dumas. The Vicomte of Bragelonne, written by Alexandre Dumas and first published in 1847, is the third and final part of the D'Artagnan romances series. Set in the years 1660 to 1673, it follows the adventures of Raoul de Bragelonne, the son of Athos, one of the famed Three Musketeers. The novel intricately weaves historical events and personal dramas, exploring themes of loyalty, love, and political intrigue during the reign of Louis XIV. Plot summary. In the year 1660, as the sun rose high over the castle of Blois, a small cavalcade led by Gaston, the Duke of Orleans, returned from an early morning hunt. The citizens of Blois barely paid attention to the nobleman, for he had become a solitary figure, shrouded in melancholy. In this town, where time seemed to slow down, the Duke spent his days in quiet despondency, away from the intrigues and splendor of the court of Louis XIV. Meanwhile, in Paris, the young and handsome Raoul de Bragelonne, son of the illustrious Athos, had been serving under the command of the great Louis de Condé. Raoul, despite his youth, was already marked by 10 victories in service of the king. With the announcement of the king's impending marriage to the Infanta of Spain, Raoul was dispatched to Blois with a mission from Condé. The king, on his way to his nuptials, would pass through Blois, and Raoul was to prepare the way for his majesty's arrival. Upon his return to Blois, Raoul felt his heart beat with excitement and anxiety. The town held not just his duty, but also his beloved, Louise de la Vallière, a maid of honor to the Duchess of Orleans. As Raoul entered the castle, fate led him to a chance encounter with Louise. Their meeting, though brief, was charged with emotion. They had grown up together, and the bond they shared had deepened into love. Yet, unspoken between them, was the shadow of the king's interest in Louise, a perilous situation that could unravel their dreams. In the glittering court of Paris, the schemes and desires of powerful men were in full play. D'Artagnan, the former captain of the Musketeers and a loyal servant to the king, had been observing the winds of change. He remained ever vigilant, sensing the undercurrents of ambition and betrayal that swirled around the young Louis XIV. The king, no longer a boy, sought to assert his power, yet he was not immune to the whims of his heart. Aramis and Porthos, former musketeers and comrades of D'Artagnan, had taken different paths. Aramis, now the Bishop of Vannes, harbored secret ambitions that went far beyond the pulpit. In the shadows, he plotted with the enigmatic figure known as the Man in the Iron Mask, a prisoner whose identity was known to only a few. Porthos, ever the loyal and good-hearted giant, found himself drawn into Aramis's schemes, unaware of the full scope of his friend's machinations. As Raoul prepared for the king's visit, his heart was heavy with the knowledge of what he could not change. He saw in Louise's eyes a glimmer of sadness, a trace of a secret she could not share. The king arrived in Blois, and amidst the splendor of the court, Louis's gaze fell upon Louise de la Vallière. The young king was captivated, and his attentions did not go unnoticed by those around him, least of all by Raoul. The days that followed were a whirlwind of courtly affairs and unspoken emotions. Louise, torn between her loyalty to the king and her love for Raoul, struggled to maintain her composure. The king's interest in her was both a blessing and a curse, a sign of favor that could elevate her or doom her. Raoul watched helplessly as the distance between them grew, as the king's desires began to cast a shadow over their love. Aramis, ever the master schemer, saw in the king's infatuation an opportunity to further his own plans. With Porthos at his side, he sought to maneuver the pieces on the board of power, with the Man in the Iron Mask at the center of his scheme. The prisoner, hidden away from the world, held a secret that could shake the very foundations of the throne. D'Artagnan, loyal to the end, saw the dangers that lay ahead. He watched as the king pursued Louise, as the court whispered and plotted. He knew that Aramis and Porthos were involved in something far more dangerous than mere court intrigue. Yet, D'Artagnan's loyalty was to the king, and he was determined to protect him, even if it meant standing against his old friends. The king's pursuit of Louise led to a fateful decision. She was to be installed in a residence of her own, a sign that the king intended to make her his mistress. Raoul, devastated, sought counsel with his father, Athos. The noble Athos, who had lived a life of honor and sacrifice, could offer little comfort to his son. He knew the ways of kings and the pain of unrequited love. In his wisdom, he urged Raoul to leave for the wars, to seek glory and distraction on the battlefield. As Raoul departed, the court continued its dance of power and passion. The schemes of Aramis reached their climax with the revelation of the man in the iron mask. This prisoner, who bore an uncanny resemblance to the king, was in fact Louis XIV's twin brother, a secret kept hidden to secure the throne. Aramis's plan to replace the king with his twin ultimately failed, leading to his downfall. In the midst of these grand machinations, Louise found herself ensnared by the king's will. Her love for Raoul, though deep and true, could not withstand the force of royal desire. She became the king's mistress, a position that brought her neither joy nor peace. Raoul, heartbroken and disillusioned, threw himself into the wars, seeking death as a release from his pain. Athos, the noble and stoic figure, watched as his son's heart was broken. He understood that the age of the Musketeers had passed, that the world they had known was fading into history. The king's power was absolute, and the dreams of love and honor were no match for the ambitions of a monarch. In the end, the lives of the Musketeers and those they loved were forever changed by the forces of power, love, and fate. The young king, now firmly in control of his kingdom, continued his reign, while Raoul, the Vicomte of Bragelonne, faded into the annals of history, a symbol of noble love sacrificed on the altar of duty and ambition. This was just one chapter in the D'Artagnan Romances series. If you want more, check out the rest of the series by Alexandre Dumas. Details are below or on Celsius 233. Remember, while our summaries capture the essence, they can never replace the full experience of reading the book. If this summary intrigued you, consider diving into the complete story, buy the book, and immerse yourself in Alexandre Dumas' original work. Bye-bye, take care, have fun.